Marco, should we get going? I know we're still missing a bunch of people. I only see a handful of folks on here, but we have to guess that maybe they're attending late.
I'm ready to get off to a good start.
Very good. I'm sorry. I can see only 6 faces, but according to the computer screen, there are 18 people on the call. So we'll hope some will be joining us a little late, but that's fine. I'll do the briefest of introductions, both of me, for those of you who don't know me yet, and for Mark Frazier Lloyd, who many of you may have known since I was a wee small Hoosier. So I'm George Boudreau. Since September, I've been the executive director of Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion. So I am the legatee of much of what we're going to talk about today. I just spent the afternoon guiding. We are back open on Sundays as of today. When you're the executive director, when you decide to open on Sundays, you get to work on Sundays. So we had some very nice folks coming through the mansion today. And it is, of course, a special year for us. It is 60 years ago now that a group of neighbors got together and said, "You're not putting a gas station here." I keep waiting for the day someone rings the doorbell and asks where the nearest gas station is, but that doesn't happen much. It was interesting when I took over here, for me at least. I hope I won't bore you all with a personal anecdote, but to realize I was following Mark Lloyd once again professionally. When I moved to Philadelphia 30 years ago this spring, Mark was a stalwart supporter of what was then called the Philadelphia Center for Early American Studies, founded by our dear late friend Richard S. Dunn, and was a constant supporter. And Mark, I remember at that time you roped me into being the Sons of the Revolution and the Society of the Cincinnati spring speaker that year. I still have wonderful memories of both, although the Cincinnati gave me a great deal of martinis before allowing me to speak. So I'm not sure how many other people remember my lecture. I don't really, but I just, getting here and moving into this office succeeding Diane Richardson this year has been kind of constantly bumping into Mark intellectually. He was almost original equipment to this historical organization. Our files are full of his writings. He did original research that still continue to shape the way our docents and interpreters give tours of this space. And he continues. I don't know, Mark, when was the last time you were at the mansion?
3 years ago.
3 years. It's
Yeah,
so we must
saw
get you back.
Diane once.
We
not long before I left.
We talk about that. We are once again a neighborhood in transition, but it's exciting to see the care and love that people are throwing into these old houses surrounding. And these folks, these neighbors really set that. I have to imagine that this would be a very different neighborhood if there were a rundown gas station sitting at this corner and not a historic house museum. Mark, I'm going to let you talk about you, and nobody really needs to hear from me today. I will apologize in advance that I'm going to mute myself, and I recommend that we all do. There, if you scroll over, there's a cute little picture of a 1930s microphone in the bottom left corner. You might want to also turn off your cameras for those of you who have cameras on right now. Again, we want to avoid the mishaps of anybody carrying their device into the facility or something. But Mark, with no further ado, I want to turn things over to you, and thank you for being our 60th anniversary presenter.
Thank you, George. And I owe thanks to many different people, really. Going back 50 years to when I started doing research and reporting it to the board at the Maxwell Mansion and the membership. Are you all, can all of you see this map called Tulpehocken Street Development on your screen? If you look down in the lower left-hand corner, you will see a caption. This is a map that I presented 10 years ago when I spoke on the history of Tulpehocken Street. And it shows the way two brothers who were developers bought up land in the early 1850s for residential development, but also for something new. They believe if they could capture the water and the power of the water on Paper Mill Run, or what is sometimes called Montashonee Creek, down there along Lincoln Drive, then they could pump it up into a water tower on Tulpahawken Street, about midway between Wayne Avenue and Green Street, on the I guess what would be called the south side. And their plans were to provide running water for every house in Germantown first. At the same time, a group of entrepreneurs were developing what was called the Germantown Gas Works. And the property still exists and is still owned by PGW on the east side of Germantown, over by Belfield Avenue and Worcester Street. It's on Belfield, between Worcester and the next street north. The introduction of running water and gas lighting was really revolutionary in American domestic history. And if you owned a house that had both of those, believe me, you were cool. You were in the midst of all the good things that were happening in American technology at that time. And here, Tulpahawken Street was right at the middle of this development of running water. So this is a map that was produced by my good friend J.M. Duffin at the University Archives of the University of Pennsylvania. Jim and I have been good friends for 45 years, and he has assumed many of my duties down there since I retired. There were others who were important in bringing me to the next screen, which I'll show you in a moment. My next door neighbors on Green Street were Dr. George and Mary Willauer. He was a retired surgeon and a perfectionist. And he insisted that every job that he asked me and my brother to do be done exactly right, which of course was reassuring since he had been a surgeon. He also had a great appreciation for work done well. And it was in his library that I found the book on the history of 19th century Germantown that really made enthusiasts out of me. It was an autobiography by a man named Cornelius Weigand, or if you prefer the German pronunciation, Weigand, W-E-Y-G-A-N-D-T. And it was his autobiography. And he called it On the Edge of Evening. He had grown up on Tulpahawken Street in the 1880s, and he recalled with utter charm and, for me, fascination, what Germantown was like in the 1880s, which is the period Maxwell Mansion celebrates. The Willauers encouraged me in this. On the other side were my good friends Marge and Luke Russell, who I think are here in attendance this afternoon. I just want to thank them for being the good souls that they are, for all the encouragement and all the fun that I had with them in the 1970s, not long after they arrived on Tulpahawken Street. I'll show you something here. I think this will work for everybody. You see that? Tulpahawken Street in 1859, and down at the bottom it says, in my difficult, sometimes scribble, prepared by me in October 1977, I have every assurance that Luke and Marge are the only people watching today who were there at that presentation in October of 1977. They were, and I gave them no end of hard time over this house called the Mrs. West. And you can see it next to the Presbyterian Church there, the second door above Green Street. Across the street from the Mrs. West, George Strawbridge had married their sister. And he and his wife must have quite some discussions. But in the end, he built this house across the street for her sisters, her three unmarried sisters. And they lived there until about 1920. Luke and Marge came into that house, and boy, did they turn it around. And I had the joy of watching them do that and of becoming their friends, which is a friendship that has endured all these years. If you cross Green Street, this is what it looks like, or it did look like in 1859. If you look at the top, the very first thing that Maxwell mentioned, that Ebenezer Maxwell did, was sell off his back lot to Jonathan and Lucy, which assisted him, Maxwell, in paying for the construction of this new house. And it's interesting to see that right next to Maxwell, the rest of the block, all the way down to Wayne Avenue, had been purchased by Francis Drexel, of the very famous private banking company, Drexel and Company. And if you run your eyes down, you'll see that I even marked the approximate location of the standpipe, which is what they called the water tower. So I think that I'm ready to, with that introduction, I think I'll jump right into the presentation itself. This is in 3 parts. And rather than ask you all to hold any questions or comments or criticisms you might have until the end, I'll stop at the end of each third and allow you to pitch in with your points of view at that point. And I think we've got it set up here so that we can unmute you when we know that you're ready to speak or ask a question. The only thing I ask is, please don't make it a long philosophical question in which you comment on things before you get to your question. Just ask the question. And I'll do my best not to be philosophical in response, because that way I can get through everybody's questions. The last owner, the last private owner of the Maxwell Mansion, you've all heard referred to as Gussie Stevenson. She was the only child of her mother's second marriage. Maxwell sold Maxwell Mansion to a man named William Hunter, Jr. in 1861. Hunter was successful in obtaining very large contracts from the Union government to supply coal to the steamships of the Union Navy. And he became very wealthy very fast. in 1864 or 65, when the emergency personal income tax returns are available, they're public. He made $350,000, if you can imagine that, in 1 year. That's a lot of money today. Imagine what that was like in 1859. And then a strange thing happened. Under circumstances that we don't fully understand, he either fell or jumped or was pushed out of a window in a hotel in New York City and died on the sidewalk below. There's never been very much discussion of what it was that happened that day, but it had nothing to do with his finances, which were solid. In any case, his widow, as you might imagine, was besieged with well-wishers, especially men who looked to marry her. She was still relatively young, in her early 30s. She and William Hunter had 4 or 5 children. They've grown and they're all around the United States now. But she ended up and decided to marry a guy named Stevenson. And you'll like this. Her father, who lived with her after the death of her husband, did not like this guy, Stevenson. And so he talked her into taking all of her assets and putting them in a trust fund. In other words, he talked her into a prenup so that Howard Stevenson couldn't get at the money. This enraged Stevenson, and he sued her. He sued his wife. And this went on for some time, all of which is documented in the Maxwell Mansion files. That's a presentation for another time. They had one child, Augusta, who was married twice, and both marriages failed. She had no children, and she lived there in the house until her death, until in 1956. Her father would own the entire property, only left her 1/4 of the property. The other 3/4 went to the American Red Cross and the Christ Church in St. Michael's there on Tulpahawken Street. So she was not in a position to do anything with the house. Her financial advisor was the person she named as her executor, and he advertised the house for the highest sum he could obtain, arguing that this was his fiduciary responsibility for the church and the American Red Cross. And sure enough, 2 enterprising merchants isn't quite the right term, 2 enterprising salesmen of the Standard Oil of California company, CalSo, it was called. They came along and said, sure, we'll buy it. And we're going to put a gasoline station there. And they signed an agreement of sale, but it was contingent on winning zoning approval for the gasoline station. And they had no idea what they were going to run into. But a little bit of background. Green Street was very, very popular among these oil and gasoline distributors. At almost every corner, Rittenhouse Street, Harvey Street, Duval Street, and then down the hill at Horder Street. On all those corners, there were gasoline stations. And this was going to be another one. The neighbors, of course, opposed it. And they rallied primarily behind the people in the church across the street, which at that time was the Second Presbyterian Church of Germantown. It had not yet merged into the Germantown Community Presbyterian Church, which is the name of the church now. They organized the neighborhood and laid the groundwork for what we know now as the West Central Germantown neighbors. And they went down to the zoning hearing and just overwhelmed the representatives from the gasoline company, the local representatives who wanted to open the gasoline station there. And so the zoning board turned it down in April of 1957. And that ended the agreement of sale with the Provident National Bank, which one of its trust officers was the executor of Gussie's estate. It did not take long, though, before that individual at Provident, whom by the way, I tried to interview him and he wouldn't agree to it, which always I thought was useful to know and remember. He then went to a auction company and put up very bright red and white auction signs all around the property for an auction to be held on Monday, September 8th, 1957. And again, he was hoping for the absolute top dollar. People who went to the auction house reported to me later in the 1970s that when they approached the agent responsible for the property and said that they wanted to live there as a family, they were discouraged. So the bank was trying to get as much money as they had hoped to get when they entered the agreement of sale with the oil company. It was not to be. There was a walkthrough of the house on, I'm going to say, Saturday, September 6th, 1957, and then the auction was held on the following Monday, the 8th. The story I received is a very interesting one. I talked with one of the two brothers who owned this oil distribution gasoline and service station company. And he told me something that was very interesting. He said, I just happened to be driving by when the auction took place. And so I stopped my car and got out and bought it. Well, I'm not so sure that that rings true in my mind, but he did buy it for 1/3 less than he had offered when it was going to be a gasoline service station. They then rented the house for a series of years, for a number of years, to a woman who had a house, had a childcare arrangement there. And that was very successful, as I heard, until her son told her, and he was a grown man, he wanted to move in with his wife and children. And the moment that happened, apparently, everything fell apart. And within a few months, the house was vacant and remained vacant. from 1962 on. It stayed that way for a while. There's no movement on the house. And then in 1964, in May of 64, a series of events occurred that were really remarkable. But that's the next chapter in this three-part presentation. If any of you have comments or questions, and want to put them up in the chat area, we can answer them right now, one by one. If not, I'll move on with the second part of the presentation.
Mark, this is Luke Russell. How you doing? I don't think you can hear me.
If she can't hear you, because when you
All right,
more wait,
We can hear you, Luke.
you can hear me? Mark, can you hear me?
You bet.
Well, I wanted to make sure that you didn't leave out the fact that you and Reggie Coots and Henry Dixon and I and a bunch of other kids closed up the downspout lines for the drop tubes all around the mansion. Remember the excavator came in and dug the trenches, and then you and I forgot his name. Well, Stokes was involved too.
Oh, that was in the 1970s, Luke.
Yeah.
I'm going to get to that.
All right.
Give me a few more minutes.
Okay.
In the period after World War II, Americans were very confident about their ability to change things for the better. And one of the ways that this manifested itself was in the whole area called urban revitalization. People really believed strongly that the cities needed to be revitalized, and that it could be done with taxpayer money and certain incentives to private investment. Within a very few years, in the late 50s and early 60s, the federal government began to fund these projects at the local level. It revolutionized, if that's the right word, the whole business of architectural education. All of a sudden, the degree to have was no longer the Bachelor of Architecture or the Master of Architecture. It was the Master of City Planning, MCP. And a lot of people found a way to double track down at Penn and come out of their graduate education with a master's degree in architecture and in city planning. All over the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, architects were being hired as planners, not just for one building or one site, but for an entire area of a city. In Germantown, the people that responded to that were businessmen in large part who organized a group called Colonial Germantown, Inc. And they worked very closely with the office of the mayor and city council to develop a relationship that permitted them to steer the redevelopment authority into Germantown in the places that they thought best. The two people who were critical here to the next step were the staff person at the Colonial Germantown office, a fellow named Jack Hornan. And Jack was just a really energetic, outgoing character that everybody loved. He was a household word in Germantown in the 1960s. Everybody knew about Jack. He was everywhere. And Jack knew what was going on at the city with regard to changes in design and construction. The other key person was Henry Magaziner. Henry was selected by the city as the city planner for the Germantown plan, which was introduced to a packed audience in the auditorium of Germantown High School in 1963. And with that single event, Magaziner became recognized as a major figure in the future of Germantown. He was already active in the Germantown Historical Society, and he was soon elected a vice president, one of 3 vice presidents. In late or mid to late April, Jack Horning got wind. My research never found out quite how, but he got wind of the fact that the Joseph Priestley home for retired Unitarian Universalist clergy, which was next door to the Maxwell Mansion, immediately to the west of it, had entered into a agreement of sale with the owners, the owners of the oil distribution company, contingent on obtaining a demolition permit from the city in order to expand the home, the Priestley home. And Jack did what he knew he was the only hope at that point. The settlement on the sale was set for May 4th. And he had heard that the Priestley House board was asking for a demolition permit for May 5th. Jack went to the Philadelphia Historical Commission. And there, he asked if they would consider the Maxwell Mansion for a Philadelphia historical certification, which would protect the mansion for 6 months from demolition. Within a week, they did so, because Germantown had a friend in the executive director of the Historical Commission, who was then a woman named Margaret Tinkham, Tinkcom, who was a PhD historian out of Penn, and who just cared everything. She grew up in Philadelphia. She cared everything for maintaining the beauty, as she saw it, of the city. It was none too soon. In fact, the Department of L&I had already issued the demolition permit. The people at the Priestley House had engaged a demolition company. The whole thing was set for settlement on the 4th and demolition on the 5th. In the midst of that, just 1 week earlier, somebody at L&I saw the list of new buildings certified as historical by the Historical Commission. And the Maxwell Mansion was on that list, and they saw that the Maxwell Mansion was also scheduled for demolition. And they revoked the demolition permit. With about 3 working days to spare, the Maxwell Mansion came that close in, April and May of 1964. The people at the Joseph Priestley House, of course, they were infuriated. They couldn't believe that this had happened, but they had no choice. Their attorney pointed out that the historical certification extended only to the house. And so they were free to demolish the large carriage house at the rear of the Maxwell Mansion. And that demolition went ahead. And there's no, we don't know anything about where that building stood. It was long gone by the time the preservationists got a hold of the property. And then a waiting game took place. And the people at the Joseph Priestley House were, as you might imagine, impatient. And they sent a letter off to the Historical Commission, asking the chair of the Historical Commission to authorize the demolition at the end of the 6-month period. The Historical Commission responded by saying no, they would make no commitment until the 6-month period was over. That was another step that helped a great deal. Meanwhile, my group of ladies, residents on Tulpehocken Street and McCallum Street, got together, and they started doing some amazing things. They put an advertisement in the New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, for those who are millionaires, parentheses, or would like to believe they are, end parentheses. And they requested that everybody contribute to saving this place. Those people were Claire Kosky and Margaret Hawley, who lived at 32 West Tulpehocken Street. Claire was a professional photographer, and Margaret was a designer at the old Smith, Klein and French firm in downtown Philadelphia. They were close friends with another person who wrote newspaper articles for the Germantown Courier and the Philadelphia Bulletin, both newspapers now gone. Her name was Margaret Halsey. And she liked to say she was from New England. That's true. She was born in New Hampshire. And she had a kind of gritty spunk associated with the New England character. And she wrote very strong articles that appeared in both the Germantown Courier and the Philadelphia Bulletin, encouraging the public to rally behind this very small group of people who wanted to save the Maxwell Mansion. They also got a hold of another friend of theirs, a woman named Katie Tomlinson. The Tomlinsons lived on West Harvey Street between McCallum and Green. Katie, was the chair or president, I'm not sure which term was used, of the West Central Germantown neighbors, which had sprung up and become active in the period since 1957. And it was Katie Tomlinson who went to Henry Magaziner and said, Henry, will you be the spokesperson for this effort? And he said, you bet. I always liked the Victorian architecture. He immediately put a number of his different influences, into play. He was able to get a resolution from the Society of Architectural Historians. He was able to get support from the Victorian Society of America. And more importantly, as the new vice president of the Germantown Historical Society, he was able to get the president, who at that time was an orphans court judge named Harold Saylor, to support this whole effort. Saylor was a recognized civic leader. He was at the very top of his career. He had been appointed to the Philadelphia Common Pleas Court and then reelected twice. He was very highly regarded in Germantown and Mount Airy and Chestnut Hill. And Saylor, as you might imagine, knew a bunch of the people on the board of the Joseph Priestley Board of Trustees. And he appealed to them and said, will you permit Henry Magaziner and me to come to the meeting when you're going to vote on this in January of 1965? And they agreed to permit him to sit in. Henry told me that at that meeting, he and Henry were welcomed and sat down, and the chair of the board introduced Judge Saylor, who spoke briefly about historic preservation in Germantown, and then turned everything over to Henry. And Henry spoke impassioned in his style about the value of this house, the value of all these houses on Hoboken Street, and the value of Germantown as a community as a whole. He sat down. He thought he had made a pretty good presentation. Immediately, the first two people who spoke said, I move the demolition. And the second person said, I second it. And so they were in a deep hole right off the bat. You could say that Judge Saylor and Henry Magaziner were about to be ushered out the door. At that critical instant, a Unitarian Universalist clergyman named Rudolph Gelsey, G-E-L-S-E-Y, who was the pastor of the Universalist Church up at Gorgas Lane and Stenton Avenue in East Mount Airy, spoke up. He was a German who had come to the United States after World War II. And he spoke about what it meant to have the architectural heritage of a city, a neighborhood, a street destroyed, as he had witnessed during World War II. And he could not believe that Americans would permit the destruction of their neighborhood in peacetime. Well, that really turned some heads. Henry said to me later that it was Rudolph Gelsey that turned the corner in that meeting. people began to speak out in favor. And the option was that instead of demolishing the building, the Priestley House Board would lease it to the Germantown Historical Society for a period of 10 years. The motion to demolish was tabled. A second motion was put forth to support the lease. Gelsey took the lead in presenting the motion and in urging people to vote for it. Vote was taken, and Gelsey's efforts took the day by one vote. The board was split down the middle, one vote. And the Germantown Historical Society got the lease in January of 1965. It was incredible that it came that close. So the Maxwell Mansion had been rescued a second time. What would happen after that was uncertain. Well, that concludes my second part. I'm about ready to go into the third and final part. If any of you have questions that you think cannot wait till the end, speak up now or hold your peace.
Mark?
Yeah.
It's Marjorie. So I just got confused in one spot, which was, I thought that the Priestley House had already been forbidden to demolish. So I think I missed a step there. That was just temporary, is that it?
Yeah, they had been forbidden to demolish under the law that still applies. It's still current in Philadelphia, that the designation of a property as historically significant will hold off any demolition permit for a period of 6 months. And they had applied, that is, the Priestley House had applied for the demolition permit in April of 64. And it had been turned down in the first week in May of 64. So by December of 64, the 6 months had elapsed. So now the Priestley House was free to seek another demolition permit. Does that
Okay.
explain it?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You bet.
Mark,
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Going back to your map that you have displayed, is the place where the standpipe, was that called the tank lot?
Yes.
And then are there any of the houses on the left side of Tulpehocken Street still existing, or are they all been replaced by later architecture?
The twin house owned by John Frazier is still standing. And the George Merchant house is still standing, but it's been heavily redone. It's been colonialized in its style.
And the last part is, you didn't give any background of the neighboring Priestley house when it came into the ownership of the Unitarians or whoever the trustees were that were intent on getting it demolished. It was, I assume, a private home that then fell to the church or something?
Yeah, it was a private home. What happened was, this entire area that you're looking at, the tank lot, as you mentioned, was purchased by Henry Howard Houston of Chestnut Hill fame. He bought it from Drexel, and he developed it in the mid-80s. And one of the houses was the house that later in the 1930s was purchased by the Priestley home as a retirement home. And I understand that perfectly well. Prior to the 1950s, most mainstream Protestant American churches had no pension plan for their clergy. And the clergy had nowhere to go when they retired and when they became older and needed housing help. And so all across the country, people stepped forward and found what they thought were big, hospitable places for clergy to live out their years. And that's it. It was no secret that the Joseph Priestley House wasn't built, it was purchased and reconstructed and controlled by the Unitarian Church on Lincoln Drive. It's just above Wayne Avenue. Germantown Unitarian Church. So it was a local institution. Does that answer your question? All right. Any others? Let's move on. Henry Magaziner agreed to serve as chair of the Maxwell Mansion Committee of the Germantown Historical Society in 1965, and he continued as chair for 3 years and then asked to step down. And when he did, it was that same group of neighborhood organizers who came to the fore. And they recruited a woman that many of you may remember named Elizabeth Jeantou, who lived at 30 West Tulpehocken Street. And I think one of her 3 children is still in the area over on McCowan Street. Eve Jeantou. Peter and I, her son, went to Central High School together in the 1960s. She became president in 1968, and it was the people on Tulpehocken Street, the local enthusiasts, who carried the Maxwell Mansion over the next 5 or 7 years. It was in the early 1970s, and I never quite found out what it was that kind of spurred their interest. But an old Germantown couple, Joe and Chim Stokes, took an interest in the mansion. And Chim in particular was very, very energetic and very creative. And she began to appeal to everybody in sight to help create a fund that would be sufficient to purchase the mansion when the lease ran out in the spring of 1975. And she was successful. I'll give you an example. I think all of you know where the Lingelbach School is, at Johnson Street and Wayne Avenue, which overlooks Lincoln Drive. Back behind the school, it's hardly visible from the corner of Johnson and Wayne Avenue, is the great mansion of John McElhenney. McElhenney was one of the people who made a great deal of money in the mid and late 19th century, outfitting towns and cities with gas for gas lighting and gas heating. His father was the person who had created the company, and the father had a big house on Upsall Street, now gone. And the son built this great big place, beautiful, beautiful house that overlooked Lincoln Drive. that's where Bonnie McElhenney Winterstein grew up. And she remembered Germantown very well from the 19-teens, 1920s, the years when she was a child and a teenager. Chim appealed to her and got her interested. Bonnie was very wealthy. Some of you may be familiar with her as the donor of art to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And it was her brother, John McElhenney, who was for many years the leading curator at the Museum of Art. Bonnie took an interest in the Maxwell Mansion. And then there was a third group, a third couple, that was very interesting. They were Bud and Helen Eden, E-D-E-N. Their mother had been a Carnell, C-A-R-N-E-L-L, and they were from the part of North Philadelphia, which had been considered upscale in the mid-19th century, near Temple University. The Edens had all this incredible Victorian furniture and other Victorian decorative arts. For example, they donated the iron paving blocks that were installed later in the back porch of the Maxwell Mansion that everybody walks over when they come in and out of the back door. The Edens also gave about 20 or 22 pieces of furniture to outfit the Carnell Suite in the restoration of a big part of the second floor of the Maxwell Mansion. Between people like Bonnie Winterstein and the Edens and the Stokeses and others, a kind of critical mass was reached. And the mansion in 1975 had the funds necessary to pay the Priestley House trustees the same sum that the Priestley House had paid the oil people to buy the place back in 1964. So at the end of the lease, again, it was a spirited debate, but it was foregone that if the organization at the Maxwell Mansion was strong enough to pay what was then considered a hefty price for a house, $30,000 or $35,000 for the Maxwell Mansion, the board at the Priestley home would sell it, and they did. And the mansion was incorporated in the summer of 1975, and it was then that the place was purchased, and the organization as we know it now was developed. The Board of Trustees headed or delegating to an executive director for the day-to-day operation of the place. I cannot emphasize enough the significance of those three people in the mid-1970s, those three families. The Carnell family represented by the Edens, Bonnie Winterstein representing the McElhenneys, and the Stokeses representing all the rest of Germantown. Together, they found a way to fund the Maxwell Mansion. And it was Bonnie Winterstein who paid for the restoration of the parlor on the first floor and the front hall stairway. Those were both achievements of hers. She was a very interesting lady. She was very, very prominent in Philadelphia high society. And every year there was some kind of a special, I can't remember the name of it now, a special ball, a special program, a special event held to support the Philadelphia Orchestra. And it was attended by all of the people who were in the social swim in Philadelphia. The people who were the major donors to that had their picture taken for the promotional book that came out each year. Bonnie always set up a date with a photographer to come out and take a picture of her at the Maxwell Mansion. As long as she appeared in the booklet, the annual event, she was pictured at the Maxwell Mansion. And so I think that was pretty much the organization that I found when I got active about 1976 or 77. And then, as you can see from this little map that's in front of you, it was in October of 77 that I spoke at the annual meeting of the Maxwell, and that got people interested in me. And ever since then, I've been very closely interested, very, very deeply interested in and closely associated with the Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion. That's the story of how the West Central Germantown neighbors organized, found the right people, and found a way to raise the money to deny the wrecking ball. And I thank you all for your patience. I hope that this has been interesting for most, in fact, for all of you. George?
Thank you, Mark. I'm sitting here listening for the bulldozers at the back door even as we speak. And I have deep regret we have no photographs of our missing carriage house. If anyone's looking to donate one, we'd very much like to have it back. But I don't know. I don't know if the neighbors would put up with me keeping cattle here either, but we'll see. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself. We don't have to go through the rigmarole of the little raised hand cartoon at the bottom unless you want to.
Raise hand. Wait. Wait.
Oops.
George, it doesn't look like we're getting.
Well, I'd follow up with one, and that is I've been curious. There's sort of two stories. One is that the Maxwell supporters founded the Victorian Society, and the other, but the Germans, the Victorian Society founded us. Which is it, chicken or egg?
I don't think either one of those is true. The Victorian Society was supportive of the Maxwell Mansion through the good offices of Henry Magaziner from the beginning. But it was not the Victorian Society that was at the center of the action.
We very much hope we can start doing combined programs again with them. We are, as I always joke, the odd man out in colonial Germantown. We're the Victorian site. So, and Suzanne Ponson, I see you have you're being.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. It's nice to meet you, Mark. I enjoyed this very much, and I should have been taking notes, but I wasn't. But I recognized many of the names that you mentioned. Not all of them, of course, but many. And I'm particularly, I'm currently the president of West Central Germantown Neighbors. And I would love for us to collaborate in some way so that, because I think that like our history has so much to do with the Maxwell Mansion's history. So George and Mark. And I'm, I'm not an historian. I appreciate all the work that you do, but I would love to somehow, if we could collaborate and because we should be maybe celebrating our 50th or 60th anniversary too. Anyway, I look forward to making with you, and I appreciate this lecture. It was very interesting.
I think
And
that's a
thank
great,
you.
that's a great idea. And of course, I follow you all. You and I have met socially
Yes.
and follow you on social media. But I think in addition, a Good House Museum has to be something of a community center. Yesterday,
Yeah.
as some of you who I think are on the call today came for coffee with neighbors, I think it's interesting that our organization calls it both coffee with neighbors and coffee for neighbors. I actually had coffee, so therefore, administratively, I can say I was with them, and I was up at dawn scouring the Northwest for a bakery to give everybody strudel yesterday. But it was exciting, and it's always one of the favorite questions I get here is when people stop by and say, "Are you a museum?" Oh, I've always wanted to go inside. It was very cute. One day we had two policemen when the alarms went off came in.
Huh.
They were absolutely fascinated by our stove.
Interesting.
And I think these two cops were about 14 years old, but it is exciting. And I think we're going to see that. I'm very strongly in favor of partnering with Historic Germantown too. And they've
Sure.
given us the first little nibble of what is called the Green Spaces grant. They've received, I think it's $500,000 in funds, and we have such generosity of our membership for our garden and the incredible work Scott Traveline does there. Many of you watch Gardening with Scott on Facebook and Instagram, and that's growing. We've just received a donation. We're going to be increasing Victorian seating on one side of the house and modern seating on the other. And I want you all to rush in because we've had a yoga teacher volunteer. She's going to start doing summer classes out in the garden, which I will not be seen in tights on the lawn. I think that would be bad for neighborhood morale, but it's exciting. Anything we can do to draw the neighborhood in, to draw the community in.
I'd
I
like to also,
really want us to grow our education program this year. I think that's, education that starts with, preschoolers and how to, get an elder hostel to come here.
sure. I'd like to also add, currently I was one of the instigators, I guess you could call it, of the Save the Train Coalition. And the train, as far as the Tulpehocken Station District and the period when or around or after, soon after, the Maxwell Mansion was built, the whole area around the train is a kind of a first, like almost suburban setting. West Central Germantown Neighbors is in the process of investigating and working with the Historical Preservation Alliance to nominate the Tulpehocken Station District. It's already on the national registry, but to have it nominated to the local registry, that's something that we're working on, and that would have, a great impact on the mansion itself too.
And so then I have to tell you, I've been asked numerous times why the mansion does not display one of the Save the Train signs.
Well, I'd be happy to give you one if you'd like.
I would like it because people have asked me if I'm opposed to trains.
Okay, I will bring it over. I'll deliver it. We'll have coffee.
Mark, this is a hot issue. If you were here, I'm sure we would have you down handcuffing yourself to something old Penn radical that you were in your youth. I'm teasing about that. Mark took me to the Union League once years ago, so I don't think.
That's
But the idea of shutting down that train line, which is, it would be cataclysmic. And I know the Russells and others are involved in preserving the building. We very much hope that to breathe some new life
right.
into that.
That's true. And another thing to know, if and your listeners are interested, is that the SEPTA has put out a RFP, a request for proposals, to develop 5 of the train stations, the historically, they're already historically designated, 3 on the Chestnut Hill West line, including Tulpehocken, and 2 on the Chestnut East side. So, I feel like there's a lot going on, and I think working together and making all these things successful, nothing but bring our image and cachet to the Philadelphia area. And yeah, so thank you very much for this.
And thank you, Suzanne. We need to get together. You know where to find me again. Well,
I do.
if nothing else, is that, as I keep promising everyone who comes to events, Dr. John Ingram has researched and developed a special historic gin and lemon cocktail that we will be premiering at the garden party next month. So if that doesn't build community, a partnership, I don't know what. I went over to the Ingrams, and he and Mary served me 3 of these things, and I could drive afterwards, sort of. But
Suzanne,
I'm seeing Roberta.
are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Yeah, I can
Norman.
hear you, Norm.
Yes,
Norman,
Norman
yes.
Marcus. With my hat as on the board for Historic Germantown, you should be working with them on the preservation side with the
I will, we
Preservation
will.
Alliance. But I'm the advisor to the Citizen Advisory Committee of SEPTA, and
I didn't know
feel
that.
free to
I didn't know
feel
that.
free to meet with me. Well, because I sort of worked with SEPTA since its inception, among other agencies.
We were here working with Henry
Glad to meet
Houston when
with
he
you
built
and
the station.
George at the mansion to go over various issues regarding Chestnut Hill West, and also to make sure we retain the Kinwood line as well.
Yes.
And because SEPTA really wants to keep them, and both those lines have had the highest amount of capital money in recent years, for lines that have marginal ridership. And so we should talk about developing ridership,
Absolutely.
particularly in Chestnut Hill West, but elsewhere.
Yeah.
And of course, the Maxwell Mansion was developed because of Chestnut Hill East, Philadelphia Germantown, Norristown Railroad, and then the Chestnut Hill Railroad, which preceded it. So, yes, you should learn the whole history of it.
I have
and also, Mark, feel
I'm
free to be
looking right
involved
now
whenever
for a
you wish
railroad
to be
historian.
on all these things.
We are we're in. I'm as Mark will tell you, I'm a collaborator in my soul. So we have a partnering program coming up with the Preservation Alliance, which at present the small group of us that are working on this together, we're looking for a railroads historian that will be a part of that. And we're also going to have I'm learning how to develop our website. Yes, I know there are errors on it and a few announcements of things that happened, when I was in middle school. But we're one of the things we're very definitely doing is we're going to continue the walking tour of this neighborhood done by a wonderful architectural historian. Mark, I wish you could come down and take this. I think you and Warren would have a lot to discuss. The last time we did it was on my very first day as executive director, and it was hot as blazes. So I run the mansion for the first time, absolutely soaking with sweat. It was not a pretty scene. But there's so much collaboration, and there's so much history and exciting stories here.
Well, the Chestnut Hill Conservancy just did a fundraiser for Save the Train, and I listened to that. Unfortunately, they didn't mention, but I know, but they did mention a lot of the, many of the ones nearby. But I'm sure, and I forget the fellow's name, but I will definitely put you in touch with him because he made a great presentation too.
We're,
Well,
we have our next
I would
meeting
like
coming up
to
soon.
meet with you if we could coordinate many of these efforts, because one problem is when each group is going off on its own, it loses
Right.
the cohesiveness. And I
Yes.
want to make sure that we have cohesiveness for everything involving the former German township, which
Yes.
really we now say Fair Hill to Chestnut Hill. And so there's a lot going on. I want to make sure everything is coordinated and nobody's tripping over anything.
I'm not sure that there is a board in Northwest Philadelphia that is allowed to exist that doesn't have Norm on it. He is, among other things, our treasurer, so he gets to deal with my bookkeeping, which is, you know, if that's not a mitzvah, Norm, I don't know what is. But
All right,
I mean,
well,
That's
let's plan on a date. I'll come over and have coffee with you and we'll share all our emails and so forth.
that's I
Sounds good.
strongly recommend that. And Louisa, I've even found out a new breakfast place in this neighborhood I'm taking you to soon. So,
Uh-huh.
but I know we've kept you all, and I suppose some folks I have to go home and make pizza sauce. So eventually, a few days every month, I try and leave Maxwell Mansion. Although I'm considering keeping a change of clothes here. It has been, Mark, so great to see you. It's been too long as we got to sit down and just visit. But I want to thank all of you who are supporters of this place that recently welcomed me and made me so very at home. And I hope we can get together soon. We will continue. We're right now in recruitment of additional people to lead Victorian theater in the remainder of the year. Josh Hishins recently left us for Elfers Alley, so we're looking for new partners in that direction. The Victorian Book Club will continue with an internationally distinguished literary scholar reading the naughty bestseller of 1840s Philadelphia, George Lippard's The Quaker City. So if you have any Quaker blood and you really want to know what your great grandfather were up to, Lippard is eye-opening. Get a cut. The book is available cheap on Amazon. Or someone said the other day you can get it for free as an ebook. So if you're an ebook person, there you go. And we have a bunch of festive events coming up. Starting with Scott Trevelyan has designed our Victorian plant sale. Scott was on medical leave for 3 months, but has been propagating Victorian plants from his wheelchair. And we are going to have cocktails and drinks in the gardens on May the 4th, which, yes, everyone has told me that Star Wars Day, May the 4th be with you. It's a terrible joke. And then we will have the old-fashioned picnic return the weekend before Independence Day, because I thought the Independence Day isn't really our holiday. And we are bringing back the magnificent Maxwell Affair at the end of the year that Jeanette Trumbull is offering us once again her home. She has a bigger ballroom than I do. So we're very excited about all of these, and we will have the Dickens Christmas party again. As threatened this year, I'm going to roast a goose so we can really eat what Bob Cratchit ate. Although the Victorian cakes we made last year seem to go over pretty well. And we'll hope to do it this year without the FBI showing up. If you don't know that story, come to Maxwell Mansion. And Louisa, you were here when we weren't exactly raided, but they just wanted to see our security tapes. If you're not a member of Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion, since they pay me to be here, I'll beg you to join. We've had a nice little, we did have a bit of a problem, as Mark, I think, was our test case on the membership system that simply crashed and wouldn't load for days. And that's fixed. We have a new volunteers page up, and we're very excited. We're about to welcome both a new museum assistant and 7 new docents. I'd love to make that 14 new docents. I want to keep us open and keep kids of all ages coming in here. And I look forward to greeting you out on the front stoop or in the back garden soon. And Mark, thank you from all of us.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Somehow, through the miracles of technology, this will be available via our website soon. Several neighbors contacted us and couldn't be here, but wanted to hear this. And Mark, I really want copies of your maps because you're the one who keeps reminding me who Mr. Fallon was. And I love to start my house tour from the front yard because I think if you're going to interpret any historic site, you have to work in context.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Well, peace be with thee, and see you here or there soon. And let's all get to work together.
All right.
Take
Bye-bye
care.
now.
All.
Have a wonderful
Nice
night,
seeing you,
everybody.
Mark.